Somebody should tell me if we're live, though. That way I'll know. Live, hooray! Yay! Cool, so I'm gonna put this on my page because I know there's folks who watch on there. And I want to make sure everyone can see it, which is very exciting. Oh, I see myself. That is super odd. Just gonna share to my me. Okay, I'm just gonna share it on my page. Hey, me. Okay. Oh, technology. Cool. Hello. Welcome to the first of a new 3-part series. I'm very excited. I think one of my favorite parts about the Passover series that we just wrapped up was that I got to be just like a big nerd about Jewish law, about halakha, because I love it. And Pesach is all about the nitty-gritty halachic stuff. And I got to indulge that love. And we're all of us rabbis, like, all trying to decide, what are we going to talk about on our lunch and learns? And everybody has different ideas. You really kind of see, like, who we each are, I think, by the things that we wanted to cover in our lunch and learns. And I racked my brains. I was like, what can I talk about that I would find very interesting and that maybe other people would find very interesting? And I came to just really lean in to my nerdiness about halakha, but also relevant stuff. So this is a 3-part series, which I have titled, and it's really only hilarious to myself. Can you do that? It's can you do that? But if you say it, it's like, can you do that? I know. See? It's literally only funny to myself. But the idea is, this is a 3-part series, and each time we're going to cover something that I get a lot of questions about. I think these are kind of, the 2 of these 3 things are things I get questions about pretty often, and the third is something that I think is extremely relevant. And in the moment when I'm dealing with this particular life cycle event, I get a lot of questions about it, and it's very important. So these are 3 different things that are totally within the bounds of halakha, Jewish law, but they're not what I would call the normative, mainstream, modern, orthodox interpretation. But just because they're not within the normative, mainstream, orthodox interpretation of halakha doesn't mean that doing things differently than that is like somehow you're just not doing something Jewish, or you're being so lenient. You're saying, well, I mean, but I'm just not going to listen to it. I think conservative Judaism proves that you can follow halakha and hold on to our tradition and say, okay, we're not going to not follow the tradition, but we're also not going to ignore the fact that we know how science works, and we know how science has changed in the past couple thousand years since these things have been thought about. So we're going to have 3 topics. These are also 3 different topics we're going to cover over the next 3 weeks that are things that I have personally engaged with. So today we're going to cover electricity. I get a lot of questions about this, which is also going to cover driving an electric car on Shabbat. So the use of electricity on Shabbat, and specifically as it pertains to driving an electric car. So if you've ever seen me in the Tesla or Ariel in the Tesla on Shabbat, you might have thought, I guess they're driving now. So we're going to talk about that. We are also going to cover, let me check my notes, make sure, because when I start talking, it just kind of goes. We're talking about, this is going to be a fun one. I think we'll do this one next week. We're going to talk about eating non-hechshered food. And hopefully, if you have time, drinking non-hechshered wine. Notice I didn't say non-kosher. We talked about this. We touched on it a little bit over the Pesach series. People saying non-kosher, but I think they really just mean non-hechshered. The food itself is kosher. It just doesn't have a hechsher, doesn't have a rabbi who has paid a certain amount of money to stamp it and say, this is kosher. So how can you eat food, perhaps just throwing it out there, from a non-kosher, a non-hechshered restaurant? How could you eat that food but still be keeping kosher? How can you drink wine that doesn't have the kosher stamp on it? And conservative Judaism would say there is a way to eat in non-hechshered restaurants and not break halakha. And there's a way to drink non-hechshered wine, but you're still drinking wine that's perfectly kosher. That's next week. That's fun. And the last one is something that is, I think, super relevant if you are not yet married. But if you even already are married, you can still kind of address this. And it is, how to phrase, like, trying to think of a way to explain this in English in like 3 seconds. But Judaism classically says that a divorce can only be initiated by a man. So if you're a woman, you're married to a man who won't divorce you, you can't get divorced Jewishly. Like you have a ketubah, you have your ketubah when you get married, you need a get, a divorce decree. And only in classical Jewish law, only a man can give a get to a woman, and a woman has to accept it. And that's how divorce happens in Judaism. But what about women who their husbands won't give them a divorce decree, even if they've left them, even if they've abandoned them, and this happens sadly very, very, very often. So conservative movement has come up with a way, which even isn't like a new thing. We just kind of reached back into our history and found things that exist that no one seems to be using right now. And again, very interesting way. And you're like, can you do that? Can Jews do that? Can Jews do this thing that's a little interesting little workaround in the halacha? Yes, you can do that. But I'll show you how in like 3 weeks. And next week, eating food in non-hechshered, non-kosher restaurants or drinking wine that isn't hechshered. Can Jews do that? But today, we will cover electricity. Electricity on Shabbat. Can Jews do that? Well, listen up and find out. So, we gotta go back several steps. Because, the Tesla is the modern thing. Then there's electricity, there's a la Jewish law, and then there's the Torah. So let's start with the Torah. Always a good place to start. Most people will say, they'll tell you if you ask them, what can't you do on Shabbat? And they will say, well, you can't work on Shabbat. Most people, regardless of the amount of Jewish background knowledge that they have, they'll say, oh, well, yeah, you can't work on Shabbat. And they think work, if you say work, they think like you can't do like your 9-to-5 job on Shabbat. Or, like if you're a lawyer, you can't lawyer. If you're a landscape artist, you can't landscape. If you're a doctor, you can't well, that's not even true. But that kind of thing. Okay. If you read in the Torah, Genesis 2, it says, very specifically, Genesis chapter 2, it's probably the first or second line. And this should sound very familiar. Vayachal Elohim b'yom hashvi'i melachto asher asa vayishbot b'yom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asa. Which, this is how it's generally translated into English. And that sounds familiar, it's because it's from the Kiddush. On the 7th day, God finished the work that God had been doing and ceased on the 7th day, Shabbat, from all the work that God had done. So melacha is the word that they're translating as work. But if you go to an Israeli and you say, work. How would you say work? They would go, ze avodah. It's avodah. So if you say work in Hebrew, it's avodah. And that's also, it's in the Torah. That's like your job. That's like work. Like I'm doing work on my homework. I'm doing work in my yard. Avodah. It's avodah. That's work. Work is not the word that the Torah uses. The Torah uses the word melacha. B'yom hashvi melachto. God's melacha. Mikol melachto. Melachto is God's work. So melacha. Melacha is not avodah. If we assume that the Torah is being purposeful in the words that are being used in it, if God was saying what God meant, let's assume that the divine had that kind of wherewithal. Then God would have said avodah. If God said don't do avodah. Not what it says. It says melacha. So melacha must not mean work. Well, luckily, the Torah is very explicit about what melacha means. And it says nothing. Torah says nothing. Torah says absolutely nothing. It'd be really convenient, if God said, oh, melacha. Well, let me tell you what I meant. Melacha is, but God doesn't do that in the Torah. So, Mishnah, fast forward a lot. Like a lot. Around the year 200, that's not the year the Mishnah was written. The Mishnah, which is the earliest formal legal writings we have, was kind of compiled and kind of put into order and, edited essentially in the year 200. It existed far, far before. Rabbis in the Mishnah were like, guys, what is this melacha thing we're not supposed to do? It doesn't even say. Torah never says. What does it mean? And they go, well, let's find out something that in there that means melacha. Because melacha clearly must be something that creates, because God ceased from creating creating the world. So clearly melacha must mean something that you're creating, and it must mean something permanent because God created the world and it is clearly permanent. I'm gesturing out the window to the world that exists. So what could God have meant? What are these creative permanent acts that are melacha? The rabbis in the Mishnaic times around the year 200, probably a little earlier. And they decided on 39 things. I promise you that we'll get to the Tesla. But you gotta build there. Told you I'm a real nerd for halacha. So there are 39 things that the rabbis determined are the melachot. That's the plural of melacha. 39 categories of things. And they extrapolated these from the things, anything that has to do with the temple. The building of the temple. And there's some, it's kind of a linguistic thing of the parallels, and we can get into that at some later date. I can look it up and give you all the information in detail if you're really curious. So anything that has to do with the temple that's creative and permanent, that is how they got these 39 categories. For example, you need challah for the tabernacle, the loaves, which are actually matzah, fun fact. So anything you need to make matzah, okay, fine. Well, what do you need to make matzah or challah? Well, you need to plant rows. Can't plant rows on Shabbat then, one of the 39. You'd have to plant seeds. Can't plant seeds on Shabbat. That's one of the 39 they determined. Well, you need to bake the loaves. You can't bake on Shabbat because you need to cook. Well, you can't cook on Shabbat. So these are the 39, these are some of the 39 meta categories of things you cannot do on Shabbat. You can't plant rows, can't dig furrows. That's what I'm going to can't dig furrows, you can't plant seeds. You can't, there's 39 things. It's hard to remember all of them. You can't cook. You can't. Now we're going to talk now about electricity specifically, because I'm sure this is going without saying, electricity didn't exist back in ancient times. So how do we get this? Well, these are the relevant melachot that come up when you talk about electricity on Shabbat and why people say you can't. There is the issue of sparking a flame. You can't ignite a flame on Shabbat. That's one of the melachot. Can't do it. Period. Boom. Can't do it. You also cannot extinguish a flame on Shabbat. That's one of the 39 melachot. I can't get you out of that one. Can't extinguish a flame. And you can't, it's called makeba patish, is kind of the short way of saying it. It's like the blow of a hammer. And you can't complete something. You can't finish a project on Shabbat. And these are the kind of the three big issues. Those are the first two on why people say you couldn't use electricity on Shabbat. Now, before I take this apart, and I will take it apart, if you don't use electricity on Shabbat, is my disclaimer. First of all, big mega disclaimer. I'm not the Mar Da'atra for Beth Yeshurun or anything related to anything in anyone's lives. I'm not a Mar Da'atra, so I don't psak halacha. If those phrases are meaningless to you, then that doesn't matter. And if those phrases mean something to you, now I'm saying it. I'm not the Mar Da'atra, and I'm not doing psak halacha for Beth Yeshurun. If you don't use electricity on Shabbat, that is a perfectly valid choice and a perfectly valid interpretation of the halacha. I get it. And there are plenty of conservative Jews who don't use electricity on Shabbat, or who use electricity on Shabbat in some ways, but not in other ways, because it could actually violate other melachot, like actual melachot. So there's all sorts of ways to live your life, and they're all very valid ways. Let's talk about electricity and Shabbat. The whole prohibition against electricity comes from a prohibition against fire. Because, as I stated, and as you well know, electricity is a modern invention. Our modern rabbis had to figure out, okay, well, what is this electricity thing similar to? Because clearly they weren't going to talk, the rabbis in the Mishnah, or the Gemara, or the Shulchan Aruch. No one's going to talk about electricity, because it didn't exist. So modern rabbis had to figure out, what is electricity similar to? And modern rabbis decided that electricity is similar to fire, because it looked to them like fire, and it was used the same way as fire. You use it for lighting, for your house, and you use it to cook. Many people use it to cook, so we're using it like fire. So if you flip a light switch, it's as if you are igniting a flame. And if you turn off a switch, It's as if you were extinguishing a flame. And the thing is, like, I see that. I can totally see how you get there. It makes that sort of sense, you know? Electricity lights our homes, and it cooks our food for many of us. So I can see how you get there. But is electricity fire? You can say yes. You can totally say yes because we use it the same way. And you could also say electricity is fire because, you know what, it's just too close for comfort. Maybe it's not exactly fire, but it's too similar to fire and we don't want to get close to that thing. And you could say, well, if you let people start using electricity in some ways, they'll start actually thinking you can do other things that violate melachot. And I actually think that's probably the best argument against using electricity. It's kind of like the argument against kitniot. You know, people didn't really ever think that you were going to, like, mix them up or they grew near each other. People, essentially modern rabbis, decided you couldn't have kitniot, which is not chametz, but things that, you know, did similar to things to chametz. People used them in a similar way to chametz. And they outlawed kitniot because they thought that people would think, if you can use millet, or if you can use beans, well, I guess you can use oats. Oh no! Oats are actually chametz. Can't have oats. So they're like, well, if people think, oh, if you can eat rice, then maybe I can use wheat. You know? No, you can't have wheat. So they outlawed kitniot because they thought people might just be getting confused, and they might think, well, if you can do one, you can do the other. So I actually think that's probably the best argument against using electricity. Because people have actually said to me, oh, well, I can use electricity. And I think, well, yeah, in some ways you could use. I'm like, oh, so like I can cook on my electric stove? I'm like, no. No, you can't cook on your electric stove or your electric oven because you can't cook. Period. Boom, boom. One of the 39 melachot. Period, boom, done. That one is directly in there. You can't cook on Shabbat. Doesn't say anything about electricity, but it does say about cooking, and you can't do it in any way, shape, or form. So all that stuff being said, electricity. Electricity does not act like fire in terms of like physics, like the science behind electricity. I had a colleague in rabbinical school. We were in the same class, kind of introductory halakha course, and he was explaining that before he came to rabbinical school, he actually worked in HVAC, so he kind of repaired heating and cooling systems. And he was mystified because we were kind of like arguing, some of us, with our teacher about using electricity on Shabbat and the possible permissibility of using electricity on Shabbat, because it's fire, right? And he said, but you guys, because it was all guys, but me. Electricity doesn't act like fire, he said. It's like water. You know, when you flip a switch, you're not sparking the electricity. And when you turn off a switch, you're not extinguishing electricity. He said, you're removing a stopper. When you flip a switch, you're removing a stopper that prevents the flow of electricity. There's always electricity flowing. And when you turn on, language is important. When you turn on a light switch, you're removing the stopper that allows electricity to flow. So then electricity flows, and now there's light. And when you turn off a light, you put that stopper back down, and now the electricity can't flow, and now there is no light. So are we worried about igniting a flame or extinguishing a flame when we use electricity? Not really. Because electricity isn't fire, actually. There is the issue also of makeh b'patish, which is finishing something being built. You could also say molid, which is kind of like a really lesser issue, which is just building in general. It's more like, do you think you're building a circuit when you flip a switch? Because if you flip a switch, again, you're not sparking anything. That's true. That's just science. But you are allowing the electricity to flow when you turn on your light switch, and are you building a circuit? I don't know if you can see my eyebrows, they're up and down. Are you building a circuit? And if you're building a circuit, you've built something, you've finished building something, makeh b'patish, oh my goodness. And you have to make a decision, essentially. there are those who would say that opening a bottle or a can on Shabbat is building something. You're building a kli. You're building a vessel. So if you have that can of tuna, and you open, you've just made a bowl. If you interpret it in that way. And if you believe then that, yes, you just built a bowl by opening a can or taking the top off a bottle, if you do believe that you just built something, then yeah, you probably couldn't use electricity, because you would then say, oh, I built, however vaguely, I just built a circuit. If you would not say that you just built a circuit, then you could say that, no, I didn't do any makeba patish, I didn't do any molid. I just removed a stopper, put a stopper back down. So that is how you can, if you choose to interpret the halakha in this way, that it is a very valid way to do it, that's how you can use electricity on Shabbat. Now, again, also, if you have any questions and we have time at the end, feel free to, I keep looking down at my phone to make sure I'm not getting any questions, because I don't want to miss them. If you have any questions, you can type them out into the Facebook Live. I'll try to answer them in a moment, or I'll get back to you later. Let's talk about Teslas. Let's talk about electric cars. Now, before we do the electric cars, I'm not going to get into, stuff you still can't do with electricity. Like, you can't use electricity to do things that are actually forbidden on Shabbat. Like, you can't say, like, oh, I can turn on my electric stove. Yeah, okay, you can turn on your electric stove. So I can cook on my electric stove. No, you can't cook on your electric stove, because you can't cook. Boom, period, done. So we're not going to talk about the things that you still can't do, because you can't do things you can't do. And, though this is very interesting, we're not going to talk about things that are a little bit halachically dicey, like the things that people like to argue about, that I find very interesting to argue about, like, can you text on your phone? Okay, well, you can use electricity. Sure, you could use electricity. Well, could you text? Because there's a prohibition against writing, and there's a prohibition against erasing. Those are melachot, av melachot, big melachot. Can't do them. Can't write, you can't erase. Well, can I text then? Is it really writing? Things that you have to debate. Can you use an electric room key at a hotel? Okay, well, it's just electricity, right? Oh, but are you sending and receiving data when you do that? You can't be carrying, you can't be transferring things on Shabbat. That's in there. Oh, no, I don't know. It's a debate. Can you use hot water in the tap? Well, or like, with the electric water heater. Well, yes, but if you turn on your hot water on your tap, then maybe it will trigger your electric water heater to boil water, because it thinks it has to refill, and that's cooking, the boiling. This is very, again, I think it's interesting, because I am, as I have said many times previously, a huge nerd about halachic stuff. And I think it's interesting, and I think that it's a way to engage Jewishly that's just as valid as any other way of engaging Jewishly. It's like the study and debate and talk about our laws and observances and rituals. But that's not what we're going to talk about today, because that is its own series. We're going to talk about electric cars. We're also not talking about regular driving. This is its own lunch and learn. I could have done a whole lunch and learn on this. We're not going to talk about driving your regular old combustion engine car on Shabbat, because, well, it's a combustion engine, so if that name doesn't already give it away, you've got sparking, you've got burning and fuel, and so that's like a whole thing. And there is the conservative tshuva that says you can drive to Shul and back on Shabbat. It's very interesting to study if you've never actually read it, which I definitely did not. I didn't know it existed before I went to rabbinical school, so there's that. The conservative tshuva that allows driving, super, super interesting, needs its own session to cover. We're not talking about that right now because we're talking about electricity, but maybe we'll talk about it at some point. If you're interested, hit me up, because the conservative tshuva on driving is very interesting. So let's talk about electric cars, driving electric cars. Can you do it? Can you do it? Hi, Slammy. There's a couple issues that if you take care of them, perhaps it is possible. One is the big one, electricity. You could drive an electric car if you didn't believe electricity was fire. If you thought electricity is fire, then obviously you couldn't, because you would be sparking a flame every time you turned it on, and you would be extinguishing the flame every time you turned it off. So there's that. In a Tesla, which is an electric car, that's not an issue because it is a fully electric car. There are also other fully electric cars. There's also an issue of something called like a brushless motor, which is what a Tesla has. There are probably other cars that have it as well. I just know we lease a Tesla. Can't afford to buy a Tesla. We can afford to lease a Tesla. So that's what we looked up as the Tesla information specifically. The Tesla has a brushless motor. Not all electric cars have this, but basically some electric cars have motors that are such that they could incidentally produce a spark, and sparks are an issue. Tesla doesn't have that particular issue. Again, big adult in a very big sense. If you don't believe electricity is fire, and if you don't believe you're building anything when you use electricity, that's not an issue with an electric car. That wouldn't be a problem with driving. So you could drive an electric car. However, there are two other issues that you do have to cover. They're not an issue if you live somewhere with an eruv. An eruv is a way of pretending like a very, very big amount of space is actually a very small amount of space. It's a fun little halakhic loophole. I love halakhic loopholes. If you know, as you'll know, if you follow me and have been, not following, I don't follow me, but you know, if you have watched any of our stuff on Pesach, making sure I'm not getting like texts that are actually questions. No, okay. So it's a thing if you have an eruv, either a constructed eruv like the string or the wire that goes around a really large space that makes pretend like it's all one big space, that means you don't have these two other issues, which means your only issue really is the electricity, and we've already determined that is not an issue. If you live in a place with a natural eruv, which is like if you live like an island, for example, or a place with mountain ranges that kind of encapsulates. So instead of saying, oh, this is private and this is public and this is this boundary and this is it, instead of basically saying like this is all one big space. That's what an eruv does. But if you don't live in a place with an eruv, which most of Houston, there's a very, very small area of Houston that is an eruv. So most of Houston is not in the eruv. There are two other issues with driving an electric car that could come up that have nothing to do with electricity, actually, because electricity, as we've discussed, is not fire, and I don't think you're actually building anything. So there's two issues. One restriction on Shabbat is you can't leave your tachom. You can't leave your area. So again, the eruv takes care of that issue because it pretends that it's all one big area, but if you don't have that, so you have to decide what that area is. Now, the rabbis have this old-timey definition of what is the bounds. How do we know what the bounds are of your village, your town, your space? So you could say, okay, well, I live in Sugarland, and I can't go to Houston because that's too far, and that's outside the bounds. Okay, you could say that. That is a valid way of interpreting your boundaries. I would also posit that in the modern time in which we live, where you could lay in your pajamas in your bed and you could learn via internet from a rabbi in Kyiv or Hong Kong or Toronto or anywhere, like what really are bounds? And maybe bounds had a different definition 50 years ago, and certainly 1,000 years ago. So I think if you redefined boundaries, that would be different. And you could drive your electric car from, hypothetically, Houston to Sugarland. There is a second issue on Shabbat that is a real issue, which is carrying. I had a different teacher in rabbinical school, who said that this is actually the easiest and the hardest of the restrictions on Shabbat because it's really, really easy to mess up. And it's really hard to understand. You can't carry. Can't carry on Shabbat. That's another reason why you like to have an eruv, so you can carry. And the rabbis really exploded carry, meaning you can't push a stroller, for example, which is very difficult when you have children. And there's no eruv, if you believe that pushing a stroller is carrying a stroller. So when it comes to driving an electric car, what about all the parts in your car? Is your car carrying those parts? Are you, by extension, carrying all those things when you drive your car on Shabbat? I would say no. I think that's a real reach. If you wanted to say yes, that's carrying, and you can't do it, okay. I mean, you can do that. I would say no. I don't think you're carrying when you drive an electric car on Shabbat. I don't think you're leaving your boundaries in this day and age when you drive an electric car on Shabbat. And I don't think electricity is fire. So yes, I would say that you can certainly turn your lights on and off on Shabbat. You could. Not making you do it, I'm saying you could do it. And I would say you could drive a fully electric car. Did not say hybrid. Those burn gas. You could drive a fully electric car on Shabbat. I think you can do all of these things. Now, there is always the question of the spirit of Shabbat. What do you want your Shabbat to feel like? Like, will it still feel like Shabbat? Will Shabbat still do what Shabbat is supposed to do if you're flipping your lights on? But what if you're watching a video? But what if you're driving? Even if something is permissible, does that mean that it's really something you need to bring into your life, into your Shabbat practice? I can't answer the question for all of you. I know what the answer is for me, and I also know that the answer kind of changes throughout time. That my Shabbat feels differently, and that maybe sometimes I need the leniency of relying on a lenient halakhic opinion, and that when I don't need that leniency anymore, I can go back to keeping a stricter halakhic opinion, for example, when it comes to anything in Jewish law, but also in electricity. So that is how you can use electricity on Shabbat. Again, there are a lot. And I don't want to, again, this is a real thing. I don't want you to think, oh, Rabbi Fort says I can use electricity on Shabbat, so I can watch videos, I can cook on my electric stove, I can text, there's so many little itty bitty details. And some of those things I think you could do. Some of those things you definitely couldn't do. And some of those things maybe you could do if you did it in a certain way. And we don't have time to really delve into them in extreme detail because I wanted to talk, about electric cars. But if you want to learn more or ask me about a specific electrical thing that you're curious about, or if you want to talk about driving an actual vroom vroom car on Shabbat, let me know, and I'm happy to have that discussion. And join me 1 week from now where we will be talking about eating in non-kosher restaurants, drinking non-kosher wine. This one's a doozy. I will try to keep it to half an hour. It's probably going to go over. But it's also really interesting, and I love kosher halakha, and I'm very excited about it. So, it's been a blast. I will see you next week. Drop me a message if you have any questions or want to argue with me. They're all fun. I like it, because if I'm not doing this kind of a thing, I'm taking care of a baby. And he's great, but I like the break to actually engage more parts of my brain. So I'm going to get back to my baby, and I will see you all next week. Be well.